My name is Rachel Monroe, and I am 32 years old, and nothing could have prepared me for the moment I woke up surrounded by the cold light of the ICU, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling my nose, the rhythmic beeping of monitors reminding me that I was still alive, though part of me wished I was not. My body was broken in ways I could not yet fully register, ribs aching with every shallow breath, my face swollen to the point that even the reflection in the small metal panel of the IV pole looked like someone else entirely. A nurse leaned over me and spoke softly, her words floating through the fog of painkillers and adrenaline, asking if I remembered who did this to me. I opened my cracked lips, tasting blood, and whispered the truth that felt heavier than my broken bones, my brother David. The word scraped my throat like glass because saying it out loud made it real. My brother beat me nearly to death. My own flesh and blood had left me in this hospital bed, and worse than the bruises was the truth of what I saw when I opened my eyes and looked past the nurse toward the hallway. There, behind the glass, illuminated by the harsh hospital lights, were my parents, and instead of rushing toward me, instead of pressing their hands to the glass in anguish, instead of even glancing in my direction, they stood wrapped around David, their arms around his shoulders, his head buried in my mother's chest, my father whispering into his ear. I could see my mother's lips form words I could not unhear. It was not your fault she asked for it. My chest tightened in a way that no medical machine could record, because in that moment I realized that the assault did not end with David's fists. It continued with my parents' embrace, their loyalty to him over me, their decision to hug the monster while I lay fighting for my life. The pain in my ribs was nothing compared to the stabbing ache in my heart. I wanted to scream, to pound on the bed rails, to demand that they look at me, see me. But my voice was a faint rasp swallowed by the steady hum of machines. Memories crashed into me like waves every childhood moment where David had been the golden boy every time I had been pushed aside, told to be quiet, told that my feelings were exaggerations, told that he never meant harm. But now, harm was written in purple and black across my skin, in the broken bones beneath my hospital gown, in the dizziness that made the ceiling spin when I tried to lift my head. The nurse adjusted my IV and whispered that I was safe now, but the truth was I had never been safe, not in that house, not in that family. And seeing my parents cradle the man who almost killed me proved it beyond doubt. Tears stung my swollen eyes and slid down into my hairline. But even as I cried, anger began to pulse inside me, stronger than morphine, stronger than fear. I thought of the way David's fist had felt against my jaw, the sound of the Thanksgiving table shattering beneath my body, the gasps of relatives fading into a blur as darkness swallowed me. I thought of how my parents had looked right at me lying on the floor bleeding and had turned their backs to comfort him. And now here I was alive, but barely, and still they chose him. They chose him. The betrayal burned hotter than any fever. I tried to move my hand to reach for the call button, but my fingers trembled too violently. The nurse noticed and placed it gently in my palm, telling me that I was strong, that survivors often underestimate their own strength. The word survivor echoed in my skull, clashing with another word that had defined me for years, burden. My parents had always said I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much trouble. David was the achiever, the favorite, the son who could do no wrong. And yet here I was, surviving the kind of beating most people never walk away from, while he was the one being hugged, pitied, defended. I closed my eyes and for a moment let myself drift back into the haze, but the image of their embrace burned into my eyelids, forcing me awake again. That was when I made a silent vow. I would not let this be the end of my story. I would not let the narrative remain that I had somehow provoked him, that I had deserved the bruises and the blood, that my pain was invisible while his reputation remained spotless. No, this time there would be consequences. This time I would gather strength not from their approval, but from the very betrayal that tried to break me. My breath came shallow and ragged, but each inhale carried a promise: I will speak. I will fight. I will not disappear beneath the weight of their lies. The nurse dimmed the lights and said she would let me rest, but I could not rest. Not yet. Not while my parents whispered comfort to my abuser in the hallway. Not while their eyes refused to meet mine. Not while every fiber of my body screamed that I had to rise not just for myself, but for the truth. I had spent a lifetime swallowing gaslight, believing their narrative that I was the problem, the instigator, the weak one. But lying in that ICU bed, wires in my arms and bruises across my skin, I realized that survival itself was proof that I was stronger than all of them, and strength, I decided, was no longer something to hide. It was something to wield. When I was a child, long before fists and hospital beds, the violence in my family came dressed in softer clothes. It was not bruises back then, it was words, comparisons, dismissals that cut just as deeply as broken bones would years later. I was 7 years old when I first realized that my parents did not see me the way they saw David. He was 9, taller, louder, always demanding attention, and they gave it willingly. When he brought home a crayon drawing from school, my mother taped it to the fridge and called him her little genius. When I brought home a spelling test with a perfect score, my father glanced at it and said, "Good now, go help your brother with his homework." Even in small moments, I was made invisible. I learned that my achievements were not cause for celebration, only stepping stones for David's spotlight. One memory stays carved in my mind. My 8th birthday. I had waited weeks for a cake, imagining candles and songs, but when the day arrived, there was no cake, no candles, just a passing remark from my father that we would celebrate later because David had a soccer game that evening. The whole family went to the field cheering for him while I sat on the sidelines clutching the small gift I had bought myself with coins saved from lunch money, a cheap bracelet from the drugstore. When he scored a goal, my parents lifted him onto their shoulders as if he had won a championship. My birthday passed unnoticed. Later that night, when I tried to remind my mother that it was my special day, she smiled thinly and said, "We cannot celebrate everything. Sweetheart, you need to learn to share the stage." That was their way of telling me I was not worthy of even one day of attention. By the time I was 12, I had learned another lesson. If David hurt me, it was somehow my fault. He shoved me down the stairs once, not hard enough to break a bone, but enough that my knees scraped raw against the wood. I cried out expecting punishment for him, but instead my mother scolded me for being dramatic and accused me of provoking him. She pressed a cold washcloth to my knees and told me that boys had tempers, that I needed to stop nagging, that I should apologize for making him angry. Apologize to the boy who had shoved me. That twisted logic lodged itself deep inside me so that every time David lashed out, I wondered if maybe I truly had caused it. Maybe I really was too sensitive. Maybe pain was something I deserved. Gaslighting does not always come with raised voices. Sometimes it is delivered with a gentle tone that makes you doubt your own reality. David learned quickly that he could get away with anything. He stole $20 from my wallet when I was 14, and when I confronted him, my father thundered at me for accusing his son of theft. The next day, David flaunted the new video game he bought with the money, and still my parents said nothing. He locked me in a dark closet once during a storm, laughing while I screamed and banged on the door. When my father found me an hour later, shaking and in tears, he told me that fear builds character and that I should not tattle on my brother for playing rough. My terror was recast as weakness, his cruelty rebranded as playfulness. That was the language of my household. David's sins erased my suffering, rewritten as lessons I was too fragile to learn. Looking back, I see how each small dismissal was a thread in the rope that would later strangle me. I was conditioned to doubt my instincts, to silence my protests, to believe that love meant enduring pain in silence. I became the quiet child, the responsible one, the girl who never asked for more than crumbs of affection because crumbs were all I ever got. My parents said I was resilient, but what they really meant was that I did not fight back. In their eyes, David was the sun, and I was the shadow that should be grateful just to exist near his light. That kind of upbringing does not vanish when you grow up. It festers, it shapes the way you see yourself, and when you finally find yourself in an ICU bed decades later, you realize that the groundwork for that violence was laid in moments as small as a forgotten birthday cake. By the time I reached my teenage years, the bruises began to replace the words. David was stronger than me, taller, with the kind of physical confidence that comes from being told your whole life that you can do no wrong. He used that power not only to control me, but to remind me daily that I was lesser. At 15, I remember standing in the kitchen holding a glass of milk when he walked in, smirked, and slapped it out of my hand. The glass shattered across the tile and cut into my bare feet. I cried out, but when my mother rushed in, she did not look at him, she looked at me. She scolded me for being careless, for making a mess, and told me to clean it up while blood dripped from my toes. David leaned against the counter, laughing, his face full of smug satisfaction, and I learned that in our house, evidence did not matter. The truth was, whatever protected David. There were other nights when his anger came suddenly, like storms that rolled in without warning. Once, he pinned me against the wall for borrowing his notebook, his forearm pressing against my throat until I could barely breathe. My father walked in, and instead of pulling him away, he barked at me to stop provoking your brother. I remember gasping for air while David's grin widened because the message was clear: he was allowed to suffocate me both literally and figuratively, and my cries for help were nothing but noise. School was the only place I thought I might escape, but even there, David's shadow followed. When he was suspended once for fighting, my parents demanded that I take the blame, telling the principal that I had lied about what I saw. I sat in that office trembling while David stared at me with a threat behind his eyes, and my mother squeezed my shoulder so hard it hurt as she whispered that family loyalty means sacrifice. So I lied. I told the principal that I must have misunderstood, that David had not thrown the first punch. He was reinstated, and I walked out feeling like I had just signed away another piece of my own dignity. By 16, I had mastered the art of silence. I wore long sleeves to cover bruises on my arms, makeup to hide the purpling around my eyes. I stopped inviting friends over because David would humiliate me in front of them, taking my diary and reading passages aloud until I burned with shame. When I told my parents how cruel it was, they only laughed and said, "Boys will be boys, you need to toughen up." That phrase became a mantra in our home, an excuse for every violent shove, every mocking insult, every violation of my privacy. Toughen up? Translation: accept the pain. Accept that you deserve it. One night during a storm, the power went out and I lit a candle in my room. David burst in, grabbed the candle, and tipped it so the hot wax spilled across my hand. I screamed, the skin blistering instantly, but when my father came running, he only asked why I was making such a fuss over a little wax. David stood there pretending innocence while I cradled my burned hand in a towel. That was when I realized that my body would never be safe in that house. Pain was invisible unless it belonged to David, and even then, it was treated like a tragedy, while mine was treated like a nuisance. These years taught me that violence could be rewritten as play, that abuse could be disguised as my own fault. I internalized the message until I could no longer tell where his cruelty ended and my supposed weakness began. I walked on eggshells every day, waiting for the next slap, the next shove, the next punishment disguised as a lesson. Each bruise was a period in a sentence my parents had been writing since my childhood: "You are nothing compared to him." And I believed it because belief was easier than fighting a war I could not win. By the time I was 27, I thought that leaving for college and finding my own job would finally give me distance from David's control, but I underestimated how deeply my parents had woven their grip into my life. I worked 2 jobs after graduation, saving every cent until I could finally buy a small condo in a quiet neighborhood. For the first time, I felt like I had built something that was mine alone, a space where I could breathe without waiting for the sound of his footsteps outside my door. That peace lasted less than 6 months. One evening, my mother called, and her voice carried that familiar mix of guilt and authority as she told me that David had fallen on hard times, that his business was struggling, and that as family, it was my duty to help. Help in their language always meant sacrifice. I said no at first, explaining that I had worked too hard to give up my home, but within weeks, David was moving in. Not asked, not invited, but moved in as if my walls and doors had never belonged to me. It started with small invasions. He left dirty dishes piled in the sink, drank my wine, and laughed when I asked him to clean up. Then he brought his friends over late at night, blasting music until the walls shook, leaving cigarette butts on the balcony and beer stains on my carpet. When I confronted him, he smirked and said, "This place is boring. I'm making it alive." I called my parents in tears, begging them to intervene, but my father only said, "Stop being selfish. Rachel family shares everything." My mother added that David just needed time to get back on his feet, and that as his sister, I should be proud to support him. Proud. That word nearly made me choke. Months dragged by, and my condo no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a prison. I began locking my bedroom door at night, afraid of the way David's temper snapped whenever I disagreed with him. Once, he kicked my dresser so hard it splintered, shouting that I was ungrateful for letting him stay. Another time, he grabbed my phone out of my hand and threw it against the wall when I refused to transfer money to cover his overdue bills. The shards of glass scattered across the floor mirrored how shattered I felt inside. Every time I tried to push back, my parents drowned me in guilt, repeating the same script they had used my whole life. He's struggling. You're strong. You can handle it. But handling it meant shrinking myself down smaller and smaller until I barely recognized the woman in the mirror. The final straw came when I found out he had listed my address on loan documents without telling me. Collectors began calling my phone demanding payments for debts I had never agreed to. I confronted him, my hands shaking as I waved the letters in his face, and he only laughed, saying, "What's the big deal? You've got a stable job, you can cover it." I felt my world tilt because I realized he did not see me as his sister at all. He saw me as a wallet, a shield, a convenient target to absorb the blows of his failures. And my parents stood behind him, nodding along, telling me that family means compromise. Compromise in their language meant erasure of my boundaries. I remember one night sitting alone on the floor of my bedroom, the smell of beer and smoke seeping under the door, my body trembling not from fear, but from the crushing weight of inevitability. This was the same pattern replaying itself, only now the stakes were higher. I had thought adulthood would free me, but instead, the chains were thicker, forged from financial traps and emotional blackmail. I realized then that no matter how old I grew, as long as I stayed connected to them without resistance, I would always be the scapegoat, the sacrifice the one expected to bleed, so David could thrive. That realization settled in my chest like ice, and I knew the storm had only begun. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a holiday about gratitude, about family gathered around the table sharing blessings, but in my family it was only another stage for humiliation, another arena where David's shadow consumed every flicker of light. That year, the dining room smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon candles flickering against the polished wood of my mother's long table silverware, gleaming as if it were a scene from a magazine. Relatives filled the seats, laughter floating for a brief moment before tension thickened the air. I had promised myself on the drive over that I would endure quietly, that I would not let their words cut me again. But promises like that never survive long in toxic households. Dinner began with the usual performance. My father boasted about David's latest plans, some vague new business venture that no one at the table truly understood, but everyone was expected to applaud. My mother poured him wine with a smile that looked rehearsed, ignoring the way he slouched in his chair with arrogance dripping from every gesture. When the conversation shifted toward me, I dared to mention the promotion I had recently earned at work, a recognition that had taken years of sleepless nights and endless effort. My father barely looked up, muttering a distracted "good for you," before turning back to David to ask about his next big idea. The applause returned hollow but loud, and I felt the familiar sting of invisibility burning at the corners of my eyes. Then came the moment that broke everything open. David leaned across the table, his grin sharp, and said in front of everyone that I should lend him money to cover his debts. He said it casually, like asking someone to pass the salt, but the weight of his words crashed into me. My fork clattered against my plate. I said no. Not quietly, not apologetically, but firmly for the first time in years. A hush fell over the table. My father's brow furrowed. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. David's smile vanished. I repeated it louder this time. "No, I am not giving you another cent." The silence shattered when my father slammed his hand on the table, rattling glasses, and barked at me to stop embarrassing the family. My mother chimed in, saying I was selfish, that I should be proud to support my brother. Something inside me snapped. I pushed back my chair and stood, my voice trembling but fierce, and declared in front of every relative that I was done being their scapegoat, done sacrificing for David, done being treated like I did not matter. I said the words I had rehearsed in my head 1,000 times. I am not your punching bag anymore. The reaction was instant. David's chair scraped back violently as he stood, his face twisted with rage. Before I could even take a step back, his fist collided with my jaw, the force sending me crashing into the table. Plates shattered, food spilled, gasps echoed from every corner of the room. Pain exploded across my face, and before I could recover, he was on me, fists raining down in a blur of motion. I heard screams, the clatter of chairs, but no one pulled him away. My parents shouted not at him, but at me, screaming that I had provoked him, that I needed to stop causing scenes. Each word cut deeper than his blows. My vision blurred as I tried to shield my head, the taste of blood filling my mouth. The table splintered beneath my weight, shards of wood biting into my arms. I remember looking sideways, my eyes catching the horrified stare of a young cousin clutching her mother's hand, and in that split second I realized the truth. I was bleeding on the floor while my family chose to protect the man who was killing me. Darkness rushed in, swallowing the room, and the last sound I heard before losing consciousness was my mother's voice telling someone to call an ambulance, but to make sure no one exaggerated what happened. When I opened my eyes again, it was not to the warmth of family or the comfort of concern. It was to the blinding lights of the ambulance paramedics shouting vitals, the siren wailing into the night. My body felt like broken glass stitched together with pain. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, I caught one final glimpse of the house through the open door. David stood on the porch with my parents flanking him, their arms around his shoulders, their expressions etched with worry for him. Not for me, for him. In that instant, I understood the full measure of betrayal. Thanksgiving was meant to celebrate gratitude, but all I was left with was the realization that in my family, gratitude meant survival for David and silence for me. And I knew even through the haze of agony that silence was no longer an option. When I woke again in the ICU, the world was quiet except for the steady beeping of machines and the low hum of fluorescent lights above me. My jaw throbbed with every heartbeat. My ribs ached so fiercely that each breath felt like a knife sliding between them. I turned my head slightly, and through the glass wall I saw them. My parents. They were not looking at me. They were seated close to David, my mother's arm around his shoulders, my father speaking in low tones as if consoling a grieving victim. I strained to hear and caught fragments that made my blood run cold. She provoked you. It wasn't your fault. She has always been dramatic. The nurse at my bedside must have seen the tears pooling in my eyes because she gently placed a hand on mine. "You are safe now," she whispered, but her words barely pierced the fog of betrayal. For hours, I drifted in and out of consciousness, every time waking to the same sight of my parents comforting the man who nearly killed me. When the doctor came in to review my injuries, I listened as my parents told him they did not want to press charges, that it was just a family argument gone too far. Their words stabbed deeper than any broken bone. My throat tightened, and I wanted to scream the truth, but my voice was weak, hoarse, barely a rasp. It did not matter anyway. They would drown me out, just like they had my entire life. But not everyone in that hospital was blind. The nurse introduced herself as Olivia, and when she adjusted my IV, she leaned down and said quietly that she had heard what my parents told the doctor. She said she had also seen the bruises, the handprint still visible on my throat, the swelling around my ribs that proved how violent the attack had been. She told me she would make sure it was all documented. Her words were like a match struck in darkness. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something stronger than despair, maybe hope, maybe defiance. Later that night, when visiting hours ended and my parents finally left, Olivia slipped into the room again. She placed a small recorder on the table and told me she had already made notes about their statements. She encouraged me to speak, to tell the truth out loud, even if my parents tried to bury it. My voice shook, but I told her everything from the shove down the stairs as a child to the Thanksgiving beating that landed me here. She listened without judgment, her eyes steady, and when I finished, she said, "You are not crazy, Rachel. You are not exaggerating. This is abuse." That validation cracked something open in me. Years of gaslighting had made me doubt every memory, but hearing someone believe me reignited my strength. 2 days later, another ally appeared, Angela Carter, an old friend from college, now a lawyer. She had seen a mutual friend's post online about me being hospitalized and came to visit. The moment she walked in and saw the state of my face, the bruises crawling like dark vines down my arms, her expression hardened. She listened as I told her what had happened, and then she asked a question no one in my family ever had. "Do you want justice?" The word justice rolled in my mind like thunder. I whispered, "Yes." She smiled grimly and said, "Then we will get it." Angela began by gathering evidence. Olivia provided detailed medical reports, photographs of every injury, and her own written statement of what she had heard my parents say. Angela asked me if I had any proof of David's threats, and I remembered the voicemails I had saved but never dared to share. Shaking hands, I gave her my phone, and she listened as David's voice snarled through the speaker, promising to make me pay, calling me worthless, telling me that one day I would regret defying him. Angela's eyes narrowed, and she said, "This is exactly what we need." That night, as I lay in the hospital bed, battered but not broken, I replayed everything in my head. For the first time, the narrative was not that I was too weak or too sensitive. The narrative was that I had survived. I had allies now, people outside my family who saw me, believed me, stood with me. The shame that had weighed on me for decades began to shift into something else. Anger, yes, but also resolve. I thought of my parents, their cold eyes fixed on David, their arms wrapped around him, their voices blaming me. I thought of every birthday forgotten, every bruise dismissed, every tear ignored. And I decided that I would no longer live as their scapegoat. I would take the very pain they had tried to bury me under and turn it into the weapon that exposed them all. When Angela returned the next day with papers to begin legal action, I signed them without hesitation. My hand trembled, but my signature was clear. Olivia squeezed my shoulder and said proudly, "This is the first step." And in that sterile hospital room surrounded by machines and pain and the ghosts of betrayal, I felt something I had not felt in years. Power. Not the power to erase the past, but the power to carve a future where I was no longer silent. The turning point had come, and I was ready to fight. The first time I walked into Angela's office after being discharged from the hospital, my body was still wrapped in bruises and my ribs ached with every movement, but my spirit was sharper than it had ever been. The walls of her office were lined with law books, shelves stacked with files that spoke of battles fought and won, and I knew that mine was about to join them. Angela looked me in the eye and said, "This will not be easy, Rachel. Your family will fight back. They will try to silence you, but you have truth on your side." I nodded, my jaw still stiff but my voice steady. I told her I had been silent for too long and I was done. She slid a stack of papers across the desk and explained the charges we would pursue: aggravated assault, attempted manslaughter, reckless endangerment. Each word landed like a stone, solid and undeniable. This was no longer just a family dispute. This was a crime. We began with the evidence. Olivia's medical records were thorough, documenting every fracture, every contusion, every internal injury. Photographs showed the swelling around my eyes, the purple and black bruises staining my skin, the bandages across my ribs. Then came the voicemails, David's voice dripping with venom, threatening me, mocking me, calling me worthless. Angela played them on a loop, her pen jotting notes, her eyes flashing with anger. She said this alone is damning, but combined with the medical evidence and Olivia's testimony, it is irrefutable. For the first time, I saw my suffering not as isolated moments, but as a mountain of proof, a case that could not be ignored. Filing the charges felt like stepping into fire. My parents called incessantly, their voices sharp with fury and pleading all at once. They said I was destroying the family, that I was cruel, that I should think about David's future. My father shouted that I was ungrateful, that after all they had done for me, this was how I repaid them. My mother wept into the phone, accusing me of betraying my blood. Every call was a reminder of the manipulation I had endured for decades, but this time I did not bend. I stopped answering. I let their words rot in voicemail boxes instead of in my heart. When the news broke that charges had been filed, the mask my family had worn for years began to crack. Neighbors whispered coworkers avoided eye contact, and for once, the golden boy image of David was under scrutiny. He hired a high-priced lawyer, a man known for protecting wealthy clients from scandal, and I knew then that this would not just be a legal battle, but a war for truth. Still, I felt stronger with every step. Each signature on a document, each meeting with Angela, each recorded statement was another piece of armor. The first preliminary hearing was surreal. I sat at a table beside Angela, my hands clenched tightly in my lap as David entered the courtroom, flanked by our parents. He wore a suit clean cut, his expression carefully molded into one of innocence. My parents walked behind him, my mother clutching his arm, my father glaring at me as though I were the criminal. When the judge read the charges aloud, I watched David's jaw tighten, his eyes flicking toward me with a hatred that felt familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. But this time, I was not the girl cowering in a bedroom, not the woman hiding bruises. I was the complainant. I was the one with the law on my side. Afterward, Angela squeezed my hand and told me that this was just the beginning, but the evidence was strong. She reminded me that trials are not about feelings, they are about facts, and our facts were unshakable. Walking out of that courthouse, the sun on my face, I felt the first taste of something that had been denied to me my whole life, justice on the horizon. It was still distant, still clouded by the storm of lawyers and lies that awaited, but it was there a glimmer I could finally reach for. The day of the trial arrived with the weight of years pressing down on me. I woke before dawn, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, every muscle tight with dread, but beneath the dread was something harder, something sharper. Determination. Angela picked me up in her car, her briefcase beside her, her calm presence anchoring me. As we pulled up to the courthouse, news vans lined the curb, cameras flashing as we walked past. For the first time, the story was no longer just whispered inside my family's walls. It was public. It was exposed. And I was no longer ashamed. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy with tension. David sat at the defense table, his lawyer whispering in his ear, his posture arrogant even under the fluorescent lights. My parents sat directly behind him, their faces drawn tight with fury, eyes locked on me as though I were the traitor. When the judge called the case, my heart pounded so hard I thought the whole room could hear it, but I lifted my chin and refused to look away. The prosecution presented the medical evidence first. Photographs of my swollen face and fractured ribs were projected onto a screen for everyone to see. I wanted to shrink to hide from the humiliating display of my broken body, but I forced myself to sit tall. Let them see. Let them witness what he did. Then came Olivia's testimony. She walked to the stand, her nurse's uniform crisp, her voice steady as she described my injuries, and repeated what she had heard my parents say, that I had provoked him, that it was not his fault, that I deserved it. A ripple moved through the courtroom. My parents shifted uncomfortably but did not meet my eyes. Olivia's words landed like thunder, undeniable, echoing against the walls. Then Angela played the voicemails. David's voice filled the room, snarling threats, mocking me, calling me names I had heard whispered in my nightmares. The jury shifted in their seats, some glancing at him, their faces etched with disgust. I saw the mask on David's face falter, his jaw clenching, his eyes darkening as the truth spilled out in his own voice. When it was my turn to testify, I stood slowly, my legs trembling but holding. I walked to the witness stand and swore to tell the truth. My throat felt dry, but as I began to speak, the words poured out. I told them about the childhood filled with gaslighting, the teenage years of bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, the adulthood stripped away when he invaded my home the Thanksgiving night when fists rained down and I tasted blood and betrayal all at once. I spoke of the moment in the ICU when I saw my parents hug him while I lay broken behind the glass. The courtroom was silent except for my voice, each sentence carrying the weight of decades of silence finally shattered. David's lawyer tried to twist my words, suggesting that I exaggerated that siblings fight, that maybe I had provoked him. For a moment, the old doubt tried to creep back in, but then I looked at the jury and saw their eyes fixed on me, saw empathy in their expressions, and I remembered Olivia's voice telling me, "You are not crazy." I steadied myself and answered firmly. No, I did not provoke him. No! This was not just a fight. This was assault. This was attempted murder. My words cut through the lawyer's tactics like glass. When the cross-examination ended, I returned to my seat exhausted but unbroken. Angela leaned close and whispered, "You did it." And for the first time, I believed it. I had faced them all, spoken my truth in front of strangers and cameras and the very people who had tried to silence me, and I had not faltered. The confrontation that had once been my greatest fear had become my greatest weapon. The day the verdict was read, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised, cameras waiting outside the doors to capture the fallout. I sat at the prosecution's table, my palms damp, my chest tight, but my eyes locked forward. David entered with his usual swagger, dressed in a tailored suit, his tie knotted perfectly as if the costume could erase the violence he carried in his fists. My parents walked behind him, their faces pale but defiant, clinging to the belief that their golden boy would be untouchable. When the jury filed in the room, fell silent, the kind of silence that presses against your skin. The foreman cleared his throat and spoke the words I had prayed to hear. Guilty. Guilty of aggravated assault. Guilty of reckless endangerment. Guilty of attempted manslaughter. Each word rang in my ears like a bell, clear and undeniable. My breath caught, and I felt tears spill down my cheeks, not from pain, but from the sudden release of years of suffocated truth. David's composure cracked. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted rage, boiling just beneath the surface. My mother gasped loudly, clutching his arm as if her disbelief alone could erase the verdict. My father muttered no over and over, his face twisted in anger, but the gavel struck and the reality could not be undone. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in state prison, citing the severity of the injuries, the prior threats, the lack of remorse. 10 years. The number echoed through my chest not as revenge, but as validation. What he did mattered. What I endured mattered. As the deputies moved to handcuff him, David turned his head toward me, his glare filled with venom, but I did not flinch. I met his eyes steady, and for once it was him behind bars, him being led away while I remained free. My parents cried out, begging the judge for leniency, pleading that prison would destroy their son. No one listened. The law had spoken. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed microphones shoved toward me, questions shouted. I stood on the steps, Angela at my side, Olivia behind me, and I spoke into the chaos. I said that silence protects abusers, that families who cover for violence are just as guilty, that no one deserves to be beaten and then told they asked for it. My voice carried over the crowd strong and unwavering. The fallout was swift. Newspapers ran headlines about the case. Local stations aired segments highlighting not only the assault, but the toxic family dynamic that enabled it. My parents became pariahs in the community. Neighbors who once admired their perfect family facade now whispered behind their backs, shaking their heads at the truth revealed. Our church, where my father had served on the council for decades, quietly asked them to step down. Relatives who had once stayed silent began reaching out to me, apologizing for the years they turned away, some even sharing their own stories of David's cruelty that they had been too afraid to admit. The golden boy image was shattered, and in its place stood the reality of who he had always been. For my parents, the consequences were not prison walls, but social exile. They called me repeatedly, some messages filled with fury, others dripping with desperation, begging me to recant, to take back what I had said. But I no longer answered. Their voices were nothing but echoes of a past I refused to live in. The last voicemail I listened to was my father's, his voice trembling as he admitted for the first time that maybe they had been wrong. I deleted it. Too late. The damage had been done. Standing in the quiet of my apartment one evening after the trial, I looked at myself in the mirror. The bruises had faded to yellow and green, my ribs still tender, but healing, yet the woman staring back at me was not the same one who had walked into Thanksgiving dinner. She was stronger scarred but unbroken, carrying proof that survival could become power. The consequences had landed not just on David, not just on my parents, but on me as well. I was free. Free from silence, free from their grip, free to write my own ending. After the trial ended and the cameras moved on, I was left with the quiet aftermath. The silence of my apartment no longer felt suffocating, it felt like a sanctuary. For the first time in my life, I could hear my own thoughts without them being drowned out by accusations or demands. I began therapy sitting across from a woman with kind eyes who listened as I unraveled decades of buried pain. Week after week, I spoke words I had once swallowed, words like abuse, betrayal, neglect. Each time I said them out loud, the weight grew lighter. She reminded me that healing was not about forgetting, but about reclaiming the pieces of myself that had been stolen. Olivia visited me once outside the hospital bringing coffee and a smile. She told me she had seen many victims come and go, but what she admired in me was my refusal to stay silent. Her words lingered with me long after she left. Angela, too, remained by my side, guiding me through paperwork appeals and the long process of rebuilding a life untangled from family chains. They became part of a new kind of family, one built not on blood, but on choice, on loyalty proven by actions, not words. Slowly, I began to rebuild. I painted my apartment in bright colors, colors I never would have dared to choose in my parents' house. I adopted a dog from a shelter, a nervous little mutt who flinched at sudden sounds but wagged his tail when he realized he was safe. In him, I saw a reflection of myself, wounded but capable of trust again. We healed together day by day, step by step. There were nights when nightmares pulled me back, when I woke drenched in sweat, hearing the echo of David's fists, the sting of my parents' voices. But instead of shrinking into silence, I wrote them down. Page after page, I poured the memories onto paper, turning pain into testimony. Eventually, those pages became a blog, then articles, then speeches at local organizations dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic violence. Each time I stood before a group of strangers and told my story, I felt the chains loosen a little more. My voice had once been dismissed, but now it carried weight. It carried truth. My parents never stopped trying to reach me. Letters arrived in the mail, some angry, some begging for forgiveness, some insisting they had only done what they thought was best. I left them unopened. Closure did not come from their apologies, it came from my refusal to need them anymore. Blood ties may have built the walls of my childhood, but love and choice built the foundation of my future. On the anniversary of the verdict, I visited the courthouse steps again, standing in the same place where I had once faced a sea of cameras. This time, there were no reporters, no flashing lights, just me and the autumn air. I closed my eyes and remembered the girl I had been, the one who sat on the sidelines of soccer games, forgotten on her birthday. The teenager hiding bruises, the woman locked in her own condo by her brother's rage. I whispered to her that we made it out, that we were free, that we had turned survival into strength. The wind carried the words away, but I knew they had already settled where they needed to inside me. Healing is not a straight line. There are still scars, still moments when I question if I am truly whole. But when I look at my life now, I see a woman who refused to be erased, who took every bruise, every betrayal, and transformed them into a declaration. I see someone who no longer waits for her parents' approval, who no longer bends beneath her brother's shadow. I see myself finally. If there is one truth I carry above all else, it is this: family is not blood. Family is who shows up when you are bleeding, who believes you when others call you dramatic, who stands beside you when the world feels like it is collapsing. Blood may bind us by chance, but love is chosen, and I choose myself. I choose healing. I choose freedom. If my story touched you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please share in the comments where you are watching from and whether you have ever faced something similar in your own family. Your words mean more than you know. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Thank you for standing with me, and remember, you are never alone.